with, and help me with your name here. I want to make sure I'm not messing it up, but with Matt Hongltz Hetling.
Oh wow,
Is that
that was
right?
good.
Is
That
that
was
it? Okay.
good.
What is the what is the like history of those names? I'm guessing that they
Um,
weren't originally together.
that's correct. I was born a Hetling, which was a Ellis Island switch up from Hertlinski, from my
Yeah.
native Poland or Ukraine, depending on who you ask and at what point in history we are. And then my wife is she was the Hongoltz, and they are Eastern European of indeterminate origin.
Was it
And she,
Czech or is it Turkish? You know?
it might be Czech.
Yeah, my
We're
wife's
not
Czech.
quite sure. Oh,
I mean, a
really? Oh,
couple generations later, she's there's a big like kind of Indian. There's a big like population in Indiana of Germans and Czech and different Europeans. So she came from Indiana, and we met at Swanee. But it
oh
looks
yeah.
she would probably be the person to ask about that. Well, so if you're a patient of mine, a lot of people I've actually recommended your first book to, just because it was kind of up their alley. Which we're not talking entirely about the first book today, but the first book is called, or it may not be your first book, but it's the first one that I read by you.
No, it
A
is.
libertarian walks into a bear, and it's basically a town of people who meet, on these online forums talking about politics. And if there were no taxes, if there were no rules, if there were no regulations, it would just be this perfect utopian society if we got rid of all that. So, spoiler alert, they get together and it works. The town is a really great place to live if you're a bear. So,
The Bears loved it.
yeah, and then, or did they? I mean, it seems like, I don't know if I know that a lot of people started with the article and then ordered your book because you had the Atlantic article, or it was in the Atlantic, wasn't it? The like condensed version of the story.
Yeah, it was in the Atavist, and
Okay.
then the New Republic did a really great write up of the book that also kind of functioned as a summary. So a lot of that's their entryway. And yeah, no, and I wasn't even there talking about libertarians when I first got to that town. I was just asking people about all these weird bear stories that we're having, and then I kind of like back ended into the libertarian thing.
Well, and it's wild. It sounds like they did something very unique to bear psychology, which is making them associate human beings with like one, food, and then two, violence and pain. So it made for a really dangerous population when some people in the town feed the bears piles of donuts and then others shoot at them with small arms or throw sticks of dynamite at them. It's just, a lot of strange neural networks that you're creating in bear brains that are not good for the overlapping Venn diagram of nature and mankind.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Also
that
think about
book's
the psychological impact of free donuts and no sleep. So like they checked a lot of boxes for.
wait. So there's something depriving the bears of sleep. What is
Well,
what?
like they weren't hibernating.
Oh,
Naturally, a bear hibernates all
I
winter.
gotcha.
And so that's a lengthy slumber. And here, like the food supply was so abundant that they said, yeah, screw it, we'll skip that part and we'll just keep eating.
Just bulking, just making the most like ripped, calorie. Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, don't talk to me until I've had my coffee and dynamite, or my donuts and dynamite. So a lot of my patients actually have read that book. They were interested in it. It's not everybody's cup. Not everybody's psychology is geared to like something like that. But I like a lot of different kinds of things, and a couple of people have read it. But the new book is Walks Like a Quack. Is that right?
If it sounds like a quack.
It sounds like a quack. So that's a book about kind of grifting, fanaticism, and pseudoscience in healthcare, so your book, the recent one, combines like all of my interests, which are psychology and healthcare and evidence-based practice, but also scams. I just have loved, since I was a little kid, every time there's one weird trick that doctors don't want you to know about, every time that there was a book that Obama did not want me to read, every time that a televangelist or online profit person had a vision that was directly related to my financial well-being. I'm there. My wife had to stop me at our last house, was like, do not call any more of these people. We are getting so much mail. Because you don't have to give them money if you just correspond with them at all. I mean, they assume the money will come if they give you enough attention, and you get some great stuff. There's do you remember Peter Popoff? Have you ever seen Peter Popoff?
Peter Popoff? No, I'm not sure I know who that is.
So, I mean, we have the memory of Goldfish with a lot of this stuff, but he was disgraced in the 80s because he was a huge televangelist. I think he was Russian or pretended to be Russian, and he would do faith healing. So the people would come up on the stage and he'd put his hands on them, and then he would be like, oh, this is what's wrong with you. And so a skeptic went in, like he would say, you know, that they had cancer or whatever, and then the person would be really amazed because he knew their healthcare. Without knowledge. And so a skeptic took a radio in there, and it was before encrypted radio. So you could, as long as you would scan the frequency, you could see which one he was on. And he had an earpiece, and his wife was reading the intake cards when people had paid to come in and telling him the stuff, but she was being really hateful. Like she was saying, you know, like, well, this fat N-word has breast cancer and just awful stuff. And so he recorded all of it, and he was disgraced. So now he's back, and he has a TV ad about how you can get miracle water from him, and the miracle water comes from a spring in Chernobyl that God told Christians about during the Chernobyl disaster, and the people who drank from it didn't get radiation poisoning. I looked into it because I was really fascinated, and finally tracked down one of the people at the factory where they package it, and they said that like it basically is just water that it's a shampoo company that bottles the thing. It's not even like regulated for healthcare. So anyway, yeah, he sent us water.
That's a very specific claim.
Well, I don't know if I would have gone if I didn't have something to do, but I was corresponding with him for a while. I mean, none of the people get money from me, but you get this bizarre stuff. Like one guy, he sent me this like basically like instructions for a spell. Like he was like, okay, you know, God wants you to do this, like put this mustard seed like counterclockwise and then throw it over your shoulder, but then take this tiny mirrored piece of paper, look at it, and then put it under your pillow for 12 hours. And then it's like, this is D&D. Like at this point, this is just witchcraft. Like, and then he was in Birmingham and was like, oh, because we've corresponded so much, come to the Hilton. Like I've rented this, and it was like a small office room. I don't know how many people were invited to this. I didn't go, but I was kind of like, you know, if it was a huge conference or something, I might've gone, but I didn't really know what I was going to be walking into a room with this dude. It might not have been him. It might be, you know, a representative or something. But I love all of that stuff. And so your book, you know, combining all these interests. And before, like, I'd like to, because the book is fascinating. It's a great read. I really recommend everybody get it. And the Audible version is really what makes it a lot easier. But before we get into like some of the characters in the book and your process of writing it and what it's about, I'd be curious to know a little bit about why you write about the things that you write about. Because what's interesting to me, like this overlap maybe doesn't make sense at first. But are you familiar with Werner Herzog? Have you ever seen Herzog's stuff?
Yeah.
So
Grizzly Man, more than a lot of other things that he's done. But no, he's once you see a clip of Werner Herzog talking, you do not forget who Werner Herzog is.
No. Sometimes you want to. But yeah, I mean, I see like a little bit of overlap in the subject matter of what y'all kind of gravitate to. And there's parts, it definitely would not be in your writing style, but there are parts of both books where you can almost hear it in Werner Herzog's voice. Like if this was a Werner Herzog documentary, they would be like, they thought the greed of the free market would be the force driving. Instead, a new type of insatiable hunger was coming to the town, you know? Or, you know, it's definitely the stuff about healthcare and faith healing in the new book. There's parts where I felt like I could hear Herzog talking. But I mean, one of the things that's interesting to me with him is that he's incredibly like logical and rooted in the real and the material. Like he famously, if you talk about yoga or shamanism, he will kick you out of his film classes without reversing you is one of the rules.
Really?
Yeah. You know, very contemptuous of anything that is kind of spiritual or religious or woo-woo or out there. I mean, he yells at people for bringing up like Jung in his classes, but then his attention is like so much on the spiritual and the insane and the depth psychology and the forces underneath human behavior. It's like the only thing that he films. And I mean, not you know, you don't take it to that extreme, but there is kind of a focus in all the stuff that I've seen your name attached to about these kind of forces beneath, you know, not fanaticism, but because some of the people don't believe what they're saying, you know, but there is something, they're kind of about religion, you know, in a way. Would you agree? Or I don't know. I'll give that to you.
No, there's definitely like a, they've wrapped their self-identities up in these kind of bizarre beliefs so completely that it fills the role of religion in their life. It's the one thing they think about and start talking about when they wake up in the morning. It's the last thing they think about before their eyes close on the pillow at night. Like this is if you are one of the guys I talked about in the book, Robert Young,
Mm-hmm.
who
Young is
believes that
fascinating.
that you can like inject baking soda into your veins to cure cancer and everything else.
In the late 90s, my grandmother had MS. She died of MS. She lived a lot longer than
I'm
they
sorry to
thought
hear
she
that.
would, but she couldn't walk by the end of her life. And she died when I was pretty young. I think I was in 5th grade or something. But my great
Mhm.
grandmother would send articles, like there would be these clippings from Young where it was like, if you mix garlic with baking soda, it'll cure cancer.
Uh,
And they were just kind of like, she didn't believe it, but or my grandmother didn't believe it, but my great grandmother, I mean, I remember because that was during his first, I
mm,
guess, foray into saying that acid causes everything. So you just throw some baking soda on it and the acid goes away, and so does the cancer.
yeah, right. And so like, when he wakes up in the morning, that's all he's thinking about is, how am I going to go sell the alkaline diet today or the pH miracle diet today or whatever brand name he's dreamed up that year. And um, it really does become like a religion, and you need it to be a religion because when
Well,
people start to
if you don't
turn to
believe it,
you,
you're not going to be able to sell it as well. You have to, even if it's a grift on some level, you have to turn that part of you
right,
off.
and you need the people who are listening to you to not go to other sources, right? Like
Mhm.
you need to be the sole source of information on this stuff, and so it kind of like goes hand in glove with religious beliefs in that, like, you there is a top down authority being interpreted by one or a select group of people. um
The
that
esoteria of it, the inner circle, and the seeing through the lies of society is it would be, even if it's secular or religion or whatever, that like that's such an important step, because then it's
yeah,
you and me against the world, and now I'm not listening to anybody but you.
exactly, right. And so and for some of them it was actual religion in the book.
Mhm.
Faith healing, like you touched on. But even for those for whom it was not a religion, it was, uh, a pseudoscience with all the trappings of like a cult.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, and I think that I mean, I definitely see that with therapists, even if the therapy that they're doing is evidence based. But I mean, in
Mhm.
advertising and religion and healthcare and whatever, I mean, I think you hit on it pretty right. It's the people who say that there is this one true cure, especially in soft sciences. When it's like when you were saying this is the only way that you can get the thing, that's where there is a problem. I mean, even if it's something that's evidence based, if I say, well, cognitive behavioral therapy works for everything, this is the only thing that works for you. If it doesn't work, then you must be doing it wrong somehow. And I become resentful of the patient. If you don't have a big bag of tools as a therapist, or if somebody tells you, oh, well, this is the only way you can have this artistic life is to buy an Apple computer or to walk into a Starbucks, in advertising, or the only way you're ever going to fill this hole in your heart is with this church, that where you're taking away choice, and that's
Yeah,
the beginning of this kind of predatory process. That
there's a lot of treatments that I don't necessarily believe in, that are out there that are not, part of the establishment medicine. I tend to basically believe in the establishment based medicine because I feel like it's been vetted enough by science. Then there's like a bucket of treatments that are like, maybe show some promise, but have not
stem
penetrated
cells or something like
into,
that.
something like that, right? But then there's, you know, even if I don't believe everything they're saying, I don't really care about them because they're just doing what they want to do and providing choices to their patients and all that. For me, the really insidious ones that we have to like we have to isolate and target and eradicate from our society are, um, the schools of thought that are like we've been talking about, just really toxic, preying on people who are very sick. Uh, Telling them not to get conventional science-based, evidence-based treatment for their fatal diseases, being heard because the people they're preying on are so desperate, and then taking all their money and too much of their remaining time as a result, and sending them to early graves. Like, you know, I may not
and probably
believe in,
making conflict with their family, because it is like a cult. The family's like, stop doing this. I mean, your last days are
yeah,
fighting with people who love you, which is so sad.
yeah, absolutely, yeah. They're totally setting that up for conflict, and you know, or maybe they're alone, or maybe they suck their family in on this ride, and yeah, you know, it's just a really, really sad situation. There's very clear victims, um, both among their patient populations, and for us as a broader society, because their methods are so damaging to, you know, that they undermine healthcare as a whole. They sow distrust, and they drive a wedge between other people and their doctors. And I think that that's really, really contemptible, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, there are some very, very nasty characters in your book, and then there's some people who believe it, but there's a part of themselves that is very undealt with, and very awful, and what it leads them to do. I mean, I was curious, to know more about the family who basically kills their daughter because they believe not in God's power, but in their power to do magic on behalf of God more than they, care to keep her alive. Which is, I don't think that was their intention, but I mean, you
Correct.
still make that choice. You're saying that, me being right is more important than us being safe and careful.
Yeah, and I'll talk about them in a second. But even for these people who have done these terrible, terrible things, you know, I hope in the book, I show that they are in some ways victims themselves. Like the
Mhm.
practitioner is a victim of their own self-delusion. Like
Well, even
some
if
of
it's
them
a
are very
small cult,
sympathetic in
like
some ways. Yeah,
the line between victim and abuser, blurs so much. Everybody
that's
who ever
right.
left, like, are you familiar with that Nexium cult? You know what I'm talking about? They made like the vow and seduced and all that on there.
Oh, yeah.
He just kind
Yes.
of repackaged NLP and Ericksonian hypnosis and said he invented it, and then it was executive coaching. But when you got up to higher levels of executive coaching, it basically turned into sexual slavery.
Oh my
But
God.
the so much
Unbelievable.
of that was like everyone who left the cult, had been doing these terrible things to other people, and then they all are in this documentary going, "Oh, I'm a victim, and this happened." And I think some of them, I don't, it's not my job to weigh their soul against a feather. I think there's some people that were more motivated by, not self-importance, but actual empathy, than other people. But there are just so many times in that Nexium documentary where you see somebody being like, "Oh, you want me to leave because the FBI is investigating? Oh my gosh, I guess all this abusive stuff that I've been doing, I was coerced into doing. Well, oh, this stuff on my laptop, is this evidence? Does this help you?" You know, like some of the people getting off in the tail end of it, you kind of wonder.
Like Nazis fleeing the ship at the end. Um, Yeah, so like for Dale and Leilani Newman, Dale and Leilani Newman, these were like, a young devout couple. They were in love, they built this a nice life for themselves. They had four nice kids, they started off in I think it was Turlock, California, um, and decided they wanted to, spread God's word and speak in Wisconsin. So they decide to go try to start a uh, 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 fellowship in Wisconsin, and they start preaching and that sort of stuff. And over time, their brand of fundamental Pentecostalism deepened, and they became convinced that if God can heal, as so many religious leaders around the world insist, then to go see a doctor would be an insult to God, right? Like, and it's fairly, it's a reasonable sounding argument, right? Yeah, the counter argument is also very easy to access and reasonable sounding. But if you hear that enough times, like, yeah, God can heal you, so why would you go to a doctor?
Well,
Don't
I
you
mean,
want
that's
to
what's kind of
put
interesting is
yourself
some
in
of these
God's hands?
people. Well, like what you're saying there is some people, most people don't think about what they believe enough to act on it, or what they say they believe enough to act on it. But I mean, you do kind of feel some sympathy, is that they're like, well, if God heals and He's
Yeah,
God, and we
yeah,
believe
yeah.
that, then wouldn't it maybe offend him to go to a hospital, and how many people say that they believe that, but don't really think about that, I don't know. I mean, they are really, you do feel like it starts off with them trying to genuinely live into this belief, that ultimately kills their kids.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, but because of course on an Easter Sunday weekend, their I think 11-year-old daughter, Kara Newman, she's not feeling too good. She's lethargic and doesn't have much of an appetite, and she starts to get very sleepy and drowsy. So they're just kind of trying to let her sleep, think it's maybe a cold or something. But it just gets worse and worse. She gets less and less responsive and less connected to the world. And so they are praying over her, right? And they go to kind of heroic efforts, doing the wrong thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're praying when they should be calling the doctor.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people are like, oh, they didn't do anything to save their daughter. But in fact, they were doing a lot. They were
And they
calling
weren't
everybody
sleeping.
they
I mean, they were
knew.
kind of working
They
themselves
weren't
up into
sleeping.
mania.
Yeah, absolutely. They're praying around the clock. They're calling friends and family and asking them to pray over this girl who's slowly slipping into a coma. They even like they had kind of a grudge going on with another devout family, and they asked that family to come. They like swallowed their pride and asked this family that they had disagreements with to come over and pray over their daughter, because they thought, oh well, maybe this is the message that we're supposed to be mending the fence with these other people that we've maybe sinned against with our pride. And so they're doing all this stuff, praying around the clock. Girl gets less and less responsive, and then finally, like a relative hears about it, who's just married into the family, like a fairly distant relative, and she's like, if that girl is comatose, um, she needs a doctor. And so she started from California calling Wisconsin emergency authorities, responders. And because it's Easter Sunday, she's having a hard time getting through. Eventually gets through, and the ambulance arrives at the Newman's house 3 minutes after the little girl has died. And it turned out that what the little girl had was juvenile diabetes, which she'd never been diagnosed with because they weren't taking her to doctors for her entire life.
Mm-hmm.
And life could have easily been saved if
Mm-hmm.
responders got there an hour before, maybe even 10 minutes before. But instead,
Mm-hmm.
she was dead. And the Newmans were so attached to their faith at that point and what they felt that faith could do. And I think it would
Mm-hmm.
be really, really horrible to own up to the fact that you've just killed your daughter. So I
Yeah.
think instead they have just kind of like perpetuated the delusion where they're
Just good
thinking
money
this
after
is God's
bad.
plan. Yeah, good money after bad. That's right. That's right. And their whole identities are still 10 years later wrapped up in the idea of faith healing and treatments that are not evidence based, and it's frustrating, it's sad, it's angering, and also triggers a lot of sympathy.
Well, and I think that their psychology. I mean, it's interesting the characters that you pick in the book, especially the way that you jump around between the different people at the beginning, the middle, and the end of their arc. But something like the faith healers, you see this psychology that's pretty different than somebody like Robert Young or the doctor that is also an alien that you talk about, who I don't think is a doctor, or an alien personally, but he you see how people who are raised in a household that is like authoritarian or hierarchical, they believe that what makes them lovable and what makes them good, and what ultimately is effective, is to be incredibly submissive, to submit, to continue to basically try harder and harder to show how much you are devoted to something. They kind of prize devotion in these things, and so you see them doubling down on that. That the proof that it not working is proof that it is a test. And everything becomes this kind of self-reinforcing thing. Whereas somebody like Robert Young is a totally different psychology. He's someone who sort of knows that he is the Messiah, that not in a religious way, who he knows that he's got something that is wonderful to say. He just doesn't really know what it is, and it changes every 4 years.
Yeah, I mean, it's really like what I came to believe is that it's really about the ego. Like, we all like to place ourselves in a narrative that makes us feel good about ourselves and makes us feel important, and like we're contributing to society and making the world a better place, and all of that. And these guys have all stumbled upon something that just it supercharges that narrative and their egos, where it says, like, not only am I a good guy, but I've got the thing in my hands that can revolutionize healthcare and save everybody who's sick. It's a hugely massive self-inflating belief that they have. And that's, in the book you mentioned, I use the term one true cure and one true curism, because they all think that they've got the one thing, the only true cure to everything.
And there's this kind of myopic Prometheanism of that they are the one bringing the fire down to the mortals, and that, people just don't know yet how grateful they should be.
The only one who stands out in that crowd for having an even bigger ego than the rest is the alien guy that you you mentioned, because he believed not only that he had the one true cure to everything, but that he was an immortal alien god sent to Earth to elevate humanity to take its place among the stars.
Yeah, it's similar to Heaven's Gate. They had that same thing, that kind of fusing Christianity with 90s technology. I've been trying for a long time to
wake up in the morning thinking that.
Well, there's still somebody in Heaven's Gate. They still run the website. They were left behind to that end. And I've corresponded with them. I really wanted to do an interview on the podcast, and they won't do it. They'll answer questions via email, but they ask that not be published or talked about. So I want to respect their wishes. But you can still go to the Heaven's Gate website. It's got the little Web 1.0 GIFs, so stars and dolphins and stuff that has not been around for a long time. But yeah, I mean, it is like that kind of, I don't know. There is kind of this overlap of the Messiah myth with, like, this Messiah Jesus figure, and then basically like kind of modern conception of the universe and space and whatever you see in a ton of cults, that kind of reconciles this tension for people. What happens to him? I mean, do you know where he is now, or what he's?
I believe he's in Mexico. I think if he was in the United States, he might face criminal charges.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because his partners have all been arrested and are facing lengthy prison terms. But he just seems to have kind of like floated away. He's a big traveler, and he went somewhere where nobody seems to be extraditing him.
Well, yeah, and you see kind of the people's ego is different, but they're all in it for their ego. Young, like, you ever figure out what he's doing with the money? I mean, you mentioned how he's, basically charging $6,000 for baking soda, but the compound and the amenities are not very nice. I mean, was that being gambled or hoarded? I mean, what was his end goal?
What I've been told, and I can't necessarily confirm this, which is why I didn't put it in the book, but I've been told that he and his family, he had a large family, he had a bunch of kids, he had a wife, and they all had, very expensive tastes, and they all indulge those tastes.
Wow.
Christmas morning there were 8 Christmas trees because there were 8 people in the family, and each Christmas tree was stacked with presents. And he liked having very nice shoes and a nice car, and they traveled a lot, sometimes to do their to spread the word of their cure, but they were also like built-in resort vacations. And so I think it was just, as quickly as the money came in, it went right back out. And you always think you're going to hit that next level where the money is going to get even better, and you just kind of never quite get there.
Yeah, he was kind of one of the least sympathetic figures that you write about.
Yeah, he's I agree with that, because he really there were signs that he maybe didn't believe in his own cures for himself.
Yeah. Like his hair.
Like his hair.
That was where they got him
right.
in court, was that he had gotten hair plugs, basically, was one of the things that was his undoing. If he believed
Right.
in baking soda, then why not use that?
After selling baking soda, or like his proprietary basic products, alkaline based products for hair regrowth, and telling people that for years, the lawyer noticed in the courtroom that when she looked at the cover of his early books compared to how he looked in the courtroom, that he suddenly had a lot more hair. And she knew that he
Yeah.
didn't do it from his products, because his products were shit. And so she forced him to admit on the stand that he'd had hair transplants. And
that is pretty low to tell other people that they need to eat baking soda for cancer, and then you don't even believe in it for hair. And then the lady in the book, who he devastates her, where cancer riddles her whole body and metastasizes, and then after she gets conventional healthcare, she sends him the lab results saying this is what chemotherapy did to the problem you caused, and then he puts that on his website like the baking soda is the thing that did the lab results. I mean, like,
yeah, and yeah, no, that was just absolutely cold-hearted, right? Like there's no other way to think about it. It's just ruthless, and he is, since the book's been published, he's been arrested again, and hopefully this time, I understand they're more serious criminal charges, and so maybe we'll put him out of commission. But that's one thing that I talk about in the book too, right? Is that once somebody has pegged their identity to these sorts of concepts, it is almost impossible for society as a whole to knock them off their course, right? Like they, in the book, you learn that these people are, being brought to court, they're being sued, they're being told that they're wrong, they're being enforced against by the FDA. They are, in some cases, going to prison for lengthy amounts of time, and none of those things get them to say, "Hey, I don't really have a miracle cure." Right? That nothing shakes them from that misinformation that they're peddling. The partner of the alien, who was dispensing basically like a diluted form of bleach to people and telling them to drink it. He was
and
in
then
prison.
telling them that the organ meat that they were pooping out was worms being released from the body.
Yeah. Oh, you're puking and having diarrhea? Oh, this must be a sign of healing. Yeah, keep it up.
Yeah.
Buy more.
Hopefully no one's listening to this on their lunch break.
Yeah, really. And yeah, that guy was in a Colombian prison for peddling this stuff, awaiting extradition to the United States for a trial. And while in prison, he was treating his fellow prisoners. So there's no amount of punishment that society can dish out that is going to knock them off. They have to be either caught earlier in life and steered gently away from those courses before they become maniacal about it, or they have to just be disempowered by somehow like driving a wedge between them and their victims. There's no easy answer to getting them off the streets and off society's back.
Well, and I think like the longer that you go on having done this damage to people and having invested in something that is silly and wrong, the harder it is for your ego to back up and see that, because you have so much to grieve. I mean, I had a patient one time, long time ago, that came in, and he was an alcoholic, but that wasn't what he was trying to treat. He was just kind of wanting therapy for some other things. And he started to see himself differently, and he was really liking it. And he was a very bright guy. So he's like engaging a ton. And then one day he said, you know what, I'm realizing you're great and I really appreciate this, but I'm not going to come back. And the reason I'm not going to come back is because I'm realizing if I do this longer, I'm going to realize that I have to get sober, that I'm an alcoholic, and I can do that. I'm not afraid of that. But if I do that, I'll realize I'll become a better husband and I'll become a better father. And that would be a good thing. But to do that, if I do that, I'll realize how long I wasn't, and I can't do that. I won't see that.
Oh,
And
Oh, what
you
a
know,
tragic
which is
story.
usually people don't leave with perfect insight like that. You know, they confabulate like, oh, it's too expensive, or you said this, and there's that he was able to pretty honestly look at what he wasn't dealing with. But there's something about time, we know that we run out of time and we've lived a certain way for a while, that you see people not able to accept it even when they face consequences and they're exposed and whatever. Because I tell that story to younger people and they're always like, college students are always like, what, the point of life is growth and I can't understand that at all. And then sometimes when I'm realizing that somebody has a pretty big thing to look at in their history, I'll offer that story a couple sessions before maybe that is going to come up. And older people, 50, 60 are just like, oh shit. It hits different, when 30 years later. So I mean, you can kind of see why, and it's like, why, if Robert Young could look in the mirror, could he live with what he saw?
Yeah, I think that's it exactly. And like much easier to think like, oh, these consequences keep falling on my head. Why is that? Well, it must be because they're corrupt and I'm a martyr, right? Like that's the next step in it, is like,
Mm-hmm.
I have this miracle cure, but I'm not getting what I should get for someone who has a miracle cure. So to solve
Mm-hmm.
that problem, that they have to invent, conspiracies of people who are lined up against them, and somehow like nefariously cheating them of their just due.
Mm-hmm. I mean, what's interesting is like the people who get into cults or into like fall prey to predatory advertising or religions or something, like there's kind of two big types. And one of them is like the kind of submissive, I need an authority figure. And generally they're pitched to totally differently. So the kind of submissive, I need an authority figure, I need to be told what to do. Okay, tell me the structure. That's one type. And the cult leaders will manage them pretty differently than the other type, which is the Messiah complex. And those people don't want you to understand them. They kind of get off to being misunderstood, because the more that I'm being misunderstood, oh, you don't get it. I'm doing this transcendent message that's blowing up your world and you can't even understand it. And the more abuse and consequences of my actions that I suffer, the more persecution is reinforcing that I'm the Messiah. I mean, you need to be misunderstood and you need to be punished in order to have that thing. And generally the people kind of exploiting them, like they handle those two personalities really differently. But I don't know if they know what they're doing, if it's completely conscious, but you see that across religion and secular cults too.
That's really interesting.
When you said you like had some stuff you didn't put in the book because you can't cite the source or something, perfectly, but with Young and the other people, was there anything that you found that was just kind of interesting during your process, or any like kind of weird things that come up as you're interviewing and going down the rabbit holes to get the information?
There were a bunch of people that I just touched on very briefly in the book that I wish I had been able to talk about more. One was a vegan activist who had his name legally changed to Herb of War, and he was into supplements, and he had kind of a life dream of coming up with an all natural version of Viagra. So he wanted something that was non-pharmaceutical, but so he spent his days and his years traveling to different countries, tracking down local legends of a plant or an herb that would reproduce the
A lot of
effects
people get
of
into
Viagra.
guaranara that way. I've seen guaranara. The people are like, the Aztecs used to use this as Viagra, and I was like, well,
Yeah. Yeah. And so he eventually gets, he's asking friends to send him samples and stuff too, and he eventually gets a product. At the time, he's running a telemarketing center in India, and he gives it to his workers, and he notices a little while later that they're giggling and won't stand up from their desks. So he's like, and he tries it himself, and he says, "This is it. This is," and it's a Chinese plant extract. So he orders it. He puts it into production. He starts selling it under the name Stiff Nights, which is not subtle, and all natural version of Viagra. And eventually somebody takes it and dies. And then the feds look at it and they test it in a lab, and it turns out it has the active ingredient for Viagra in it. And his Chinese suppliers were lying to him, basically.
They're just dumping
So,
Viagra onto, parsley or something and selling it.
yeah, right. Or coming up with like a chemical analog, I think. So like it's a unique thing because you don't want to have Viagra suing you, but it's okay to dupe the public and the government. And so he gets put out of business, and that whole thing blows up in his face. But yeah, so he was an interesting character. There's also a really interesting historical storyline that I had to cull from the book because it was one storyline too many. But it was about a time in the 1800s when a guy named Samuel Thompson he started a medical freedom movement because he was like an herbalist who ran afoul of the medical institutions of the day, and he successfully kind of gathered together all of the alternative healers in a war against the doctors of the time. And they went and on a state by state basis had all medical licensing revoked. So
When
states
was
were
this?
not 1820s, 1830s.
Was that what's the name of the author who wrote that novel, E.T. Dorfa? And he had like that huge medical herbal medicine library in like the Midwest somewhere. Is that movement, or is that?
I think if I'm thinking of the right thing that you're referring to, is that like the eclectic movement?
I have to look it up.
I think that was like that came a little bit after this guy, but drew on this guy.
Because nothing really was evidence based at that point. I mean, it was all guesses and half right.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of like the university doctors had the scientific method, but it hadn't really been applied very successfully, right? So yeah, they were still doing a bunch of bad stuff. They were giving people mercury and sawing off legs unnecessarily and that sort of thing.
Pulling teeth out to cure mental illness. That was the big thing at that point, was that schizophrenia and things were caused by germs in your teeth. So if you pull out all the teeth, that was one guy that went across Europe.
That is horrifying. Yep. Oh my God. What an image.
They're like, yeah, these people are so much quieter and they bite so much less when they're.
Oh my God. That's awful. This guy was what they call a steam doctor. So he believed that heat was the cure to everything. And so he would try to basically like steam the disease out of you, or give you stuff to make you puke, or cayenne enema, that sort of thing.
They were kind of extrapolating, at that point, what hot springs were always recommended if you had cramps or whatever. They'd tell you go get in the hot spring. So these guys extrapolated, well, we can get stuff a whole lot hotter with technology than water that comes out of the ground. So surely this will be more effective. And they cooked people. I mean,
they cooked people. Exactly right. And and there were no medical licensing laws. So there were no state certified doctors. It was all just, free market, frontiersville. And so a lot of people were steamed to death by steam doctors as a result. And then this guy, he eventually fell sick, Samuel Thompson, in his old age, and they started working him over with his own treatments. And at one point he was saying, like, stop, let me die. And they wouldn't let him die. They kept working on him for 3 or 4 more days before he finally gave out.
Is there something that is uniquely American about that kind of grift? I mean, it seems like, you see these things internationally, but there's something about America in politics and religion and healthcare that is kind of not even good grifting. It's really like soap with a prize in it type. What is that? Do you have a theory?
I think the thing that's really unique about American culture is how much like free enterprise and entrepreneurialism and
the free market as religion. That somehow if you just let the economics go run wild, they have some greater spiritual plan that we can't understand.
Yeah. And sales pitches are a part of that, right? We have a real tolerance for advertising here that I think they don't have in other countries.
It is a tolerance. I mean, you show an ad from the 50s to somebody where it's like 9 out of 10 doctors recommend real made with real powdered heroin. Like that, it doesn't work. You have to, I mean, and the internet moving things at light speed means that our tolerance goes up so much that it's like we don't even know what an ad is anymore. I mean, half the stuff on YouTube, the ad is like somebody,
Yes.
it's like this jump scare of somebody throwing up and then being like, "Oh, I wish I drank this coffee" or something. You're like, "What?" You know, what do you
Right,
like?
right.
You know,
Yeah, yeah.
it is tolerance. I mean, that's true. We get resistant, and then people invent this new thing.
Yeah, yeah, and I think as a result, like, in other countries, I think a lot of the alternative medicine markets are, you know, they're a little better regulated. Like here in America, like, the state of Nevada has an interesting situation where they have a board of homeopathy, a state certified board of homeopathy, and homeopathy is bunk, right? It's not real. It's basically bottles of water,
Mhm,
with some uh, theories that don't work wrapped up in its packaging.
mhm,
And but they've got a state certified board of homeopathy where practitioners of that craft sit on the board and they look at their members and they just make sure, um, our members aren't sleeping with their patients. Our members aren't telling people not to go to a doctor with a fatal disease. Like
yeah,
some just real baseline requirements to make sure that they're not hurting society. Other than that,
yeah,
they're maybe selling something that is worthless, but they're not doing these kinds of more serious grifts and harms. And that I think is a pretty good model, and I think that
yeah,
is probably what we see reflected in Europe and a lot of other countries. But America's medical freedom movement doesn't want that.
mhm.
That's too much oversight for them. And
Well, and
so,
you talk about
uh,
how the medical freedom movement is kind of a front for some other nefarious forces that you know, it's this way that you can come in and basically hoard money and deregulate and remove any kind of social obligation to spend taxes on, you know, healthcare by pretending that it's giving people this wonderful choice, you know.
yeah, yeah, they come out with they're leading with their best possible argument, which is you should have a choice to buy the healthcare that you want. But on the back end of
Mhm,
that argument is uh, hospitals shouldn't have to be required to accept you into the emergency room. So if
mhm.
you come to a hospital, you have to bring the means to pay for your medical emergency up front. And they don't want any cancer research funded by the government, which is most cancer research. And they don't
Yeah.
want the FDA to
Well, and
exist.
most drug research too. That's what's nuts to me
Yeah,
without, you know, going too far off the topic. Like if I pay for something, I want to own it, right? And we pay for these drugs to be developed, all the drugs that we take, but we don't own them. We pay a company, we're like, "Hey, here's $1 billion. Please go make a drug that you own and can charge $500 a pill for." Why? You know,
yeah,
if I paid for it, I want it to be mine. And the government should decide the rate of the drugs that they developed. But you know, we have this free market approach, which is really, you know, corporate socialism, essentially. You're just giving money to
yeah.
corporations and
That's
calling it a free
absolutely
market
right.
for some reason.
Yeah, and it's really funny. I think like on when I talk about kind of like commonalities between the left and the right and conservatives and progressives, like the populist conservative movement that's been happening here for the last 10 years or so, that is targeting the elites, right? And
Mhm,
progressives have been targeting the elites for decades, right? Like we all hate the
mhm,
elites, but it's just a little tweak in messaging where
yeah,
progressives have problems with the corporate elites, right? And
mhm,
those are all the guys with all the money who are calling the tunes that we all have to dance to. And conservatives, they've kind of like transferred that notion of elitism onto the government.
yeah,
And the government is our chance to knock down elitism. It's not
mhm,
our yeah. So like uh I think what one of the people that I talked to in the Bear book said, like, if you have um public representation without corporations, then it's just pure democracy. If you have corporations without public representation, then that's slavery, right?
mhm,
Uh, and so, I think the populist right has kind of co-opted the message of anti-elitism and redirected it against those forces that have the best chance of solving problems like income inequality and requiring billionaires to pay taxes. It seems like a pretty easy ask that the billionaires ought to pay taxes, but somehow
or just maybe the
works.
Same percentage of taxes as the person making $30,000 a year.
Right, yeah.
For some reason that their percentage of income is higher. Yeah, and I mean, somebody like Trump uses the language of Occupy Wall Street when they're campaigning. I mean, the progressive movement, and I think the more traditional Republicans and liberals view sort of like social behavior coming from values, that people just are not believing the right thing or valuing the right thing, whereas more progressive and increasingly kind of fringe right groups think that material reality creates values, and that if and so like a lot of the progressive argument would be like, well, if you can't afford, if you're trying to use inflation as this cudgel to whip labor to go back to work, but if somebody can't afford a house, a car, or not a house, but just a place to live, and a car to get them to work, since we don't have public transportation, and maybe like some healthcare to keep them alive or something, why would I work if I can only get one of these things? One, I need the car to have the job, and then two, why am I going to do it? And that material reality is creating a labor crisis. Whereas, I think more of a liberal or conservative Republican take is like, well, people just don't work anymore because they don't believe what I believed, or they're not as, valorous, or I don't know what it is. I've heard it put some place, but they don't make sense to me.
Yeah. People talk about like they want to turn the clock back to the 50s, and ignoring the social justice problems with that.
Let's make public education, public college cost $100 a year again. That would be great. Let's turn the clock back to 1950.
Let's turn the tax rate back to 1950. Let's create a standard of expectation in the workplace so that a single breadwinner can earn enough to support a family of four, right? Like that was how it worked. Now it's like couples got to work 3 jobs to support 2 kids, and so it's just the biggest grift of all. And the medical freedom movement has been really instrumental in advancing that, but because doctors are an easy target, because we don't like doctors, do we? We have a natural fear of doctors, and doctors often don't help their own cases any, because they make so much money, and because they can look down on their patients from such a high distance. There's a cultural wedge between doctors and their patients, and so we take those sorts of facts and then we extrapolate them into doctors are corrupt and all their cures are ineffective, and that's just simply not true.
Well, and it is an easy target, because there are some professions where some of the people in them are perfectly nice. Doctors, lawyers, and police officers. Like, a lot of people are doing a great job. I would say most people, but there are spheres of those practice domains where the law is optional to you, and I think that is the problem. There should not be places where the law is optional for certain careers, and unfortunately, there are. I mean, there are places where there's no consequences. But I mean, the thing that we're talking about with politics is also the same thing that you're talking about in the book with medicine, which is that a ton of times what those people are good at, which, I mean, I think if we had more clarity and probably a better press, this would benefit politics and medicine, is that there are real problems and real corruption that these grifters point out. And they're like, look, this is what the psychopharmacology industry is doing. This is what Pfizer's doing. This is how research is wrong. This is what's whatever. And they're correct. Like, it's corrupt. It's not fair. It's not right. But the answer to that is not, leeches and baking soda. But you're when you're listening to this person and you're agreeing with the first 90% of what they say, you're going to agree with the last 10%. And that is the issue. I mean, I think a ton of the time, you watch Fox News and they say Trump is good. And then you watch CNN and they say, Clinton or Biden is good, but neither one of them criticizes the very real problems with their candidate. And so the other side can sit there and say, oh, well, they're corrupt and lying because they're not telling me this. And they're right. If you had, actual, the pre-1980s legislation where the news had to tell the truth and you couldn't advertise during it because you were working for the people and the government paid for it, and there were, regulations on what you could call news, then you would have to tell the truth. And whatever channel you're watching, they're lying by omission, and people use that to justify things that are incredibly destructive.
There's some good organizations out there that rate the political bias of various news organizations, and you can find ones that are near the center, and you can find organizations that are aggressively nonpartisan, and that are really reputable sources of information. And that's probably the good way to go. Like, I worked in several different newsrooms over the course of my career as a journalist, and we weren't sitting around thinking like, oh, how can we make a Republican politician look bad, or how can we pump up this progressive politician. That's not how it works. The bias comes from the limited understanding that our own personal worldviews give us. So, like, for example, in our small town rural community, we would cover, all the little league games. Well, what's something? We might cover Earth Day every year, right? And we might cover, I don't know, some sort of social causes that we might check in because they were on our radar. But we wouldn't write, for example, about hunting, right? And some people in our community may have had like a significant, may have taken a bear of an unusual size, and that's just because it's not on our radar, and it's not because a progressive journalist misses the is trying to ignore that right-wing culture. But I think there's some cultural features that are not covered in the mainstream news, and that in and of itself is a problem, because that's how you build trust with an audience, is you report
you write
on the
things I
size
care
of the
about,
bear.
even if you don't care about them. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, exactly right. And that creates a baseline. And then when you're talking about political candidates in an honest and fair way, more people are listening to you and trusting what you have to say.
Yeah, but Matt, that doesn't get my blood pressure up. I kind of this is the dopamine hit that I get through my day, is when I get to sit in the easy boy and yell at the news and throw the hot pocket at the bad guy. So when you're kind of making me weigh both sides, I don't really feel as important and excitable.
I want to watch Twitter and just see like the worst 0.1% of people who don't have my point of view, and I just want to like extrapolate from them that's how everybody is.
Well, and it's wild that well, I mean, that's why, occasionally somebody's like, well, I'm going to make right-wing Twitter or whatever, and it doesn't work because we don't want that. We don't want to be like free market. Yes, I agree. We want to be able to call each other names and throw doo-doo. Like, that's what's fun.
And then like 4chan goes free market, and next thing you know, you have like pedophiles and people making murder plots and all of that. Like, it just becomes a cesspool.
Well, I mean, investigative journalism can be fascinating, but I think that political journalism needs to be boring. Like, if it's starting to sound like the plot of Star Wars and there's too much hero's journey in it, then that's a problem. And I mean, like, it's like I'm a mandated reporter of certain things, and if the left and right, there's stuff going on in the Senate that if it was happening in a family, it would be reportable as elder abuse to DHR. But because it's happening in the Senate, I guess I don't need to report it, because that's just kind of a wild development. But I think go ahead.
A comedian, it just reminds me of a comedian bit that I heard like probably 30 years ago, where it's like they have to be careful what they show on television, because in prisons, because if you're airing like a hockey game, you're watching somebody have to take the penalty box for 2 minutes for hitting someone with a stick, and the people watching are serving 4 to 7 years for the same offense.
Yeah, I think that a lot of, well, and I'd be interested to get your take on this, because I think that psychology does function pretty differently from medical healthcare. Because it is half art, half science, whereas like you can do a randomized controlled trial and say which one of these drugs makes the tumor get smaller. You're measuring a tumor. That's a number, whereas psychology has sort of become something that we're trying to turn into a number and it's not. I don't know if you've ever seen any of Adam Curtis's movies, but that's kind of his critique, is that when we start to think about people like computers you can program, it's when our civilization goes off the rails and the structures of government fail to work, because we're not computers. The title of his movie, All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace, comes from the name of a poem that an engineer does in the 70s, who kind of goes off the rails, and he's like, well, I'm going to draw a circuit diagram of all of nature. So the deer eats the corn, and that's +2 amperage, but then it goes into the muscle, which is the resistor. Like, just this thing that is so wild, but people think, that it works. And
that's like such a seductive image, though, isn't it? That like, I can build the model that describes an ecosystem, or the board game that describes a person. Like, something in me really loves that idea, even as I know that it's not realistic. That
something in all of us, it's that archetype of the one unifying theory of everything,
Right. In the book, I call them the numbers junkies, right? When you're just looking at the data, and when you become so attached to the data that you're micromanaging everything, and you're maybe ignoring the facts in your face, which might cause you to deviate from a numbers-based analytical approach. But by definition, it's hard to quantify when you should abandon those sorts of approaches, and so it really is a difficult, thorny problem.
Well, and that's my point with psychology, is it's like you see things like cognitive behavioral therapy, which is fine. Like, we all do some cognitive behavioral therapy, but what CBT is it's basically psychoeducation about the nature of symptomology and behavior, and ego management strategies. All the research will tell you, and you can disagree. I don't want to make clear Matt's not endorsing what I'm saying. This is just kind of a topic of interest for me. But CBT will be held up as the gold standard because it's researchable. So if you're researching everything equally, and then you're comparing them, and this one is better, then it's better. But if you're only researching this one because you can turn it into a number, because what CBT does is it only looks at behavior. It doesn't really look at how you feel, unless you can turn that into a number and say, well, I feel 8 out of 10. And so, I've turned down job offers to program computers to do CBT for hospitals. It's a completely manualized form of therapy. There's no intuition on the clinician. There's no intuition on the patient. You're either doing it right or wrong. You said this, and I got it right and said, well, that's actually magical thinking, so it's irrational, so don't think that. Seriously, that's how it works. And I'm not making fun of it because it has a place, but that gaslights trauma patients. You're telling somebody with DID who has an alter where they completely dissociate and maybe remember when they're a kid and they related to the strength of the cat while dad was beating them, and they become cat-like. Well, just snap the rubber band and tell the anxiety to stop. That does not work. You have to get this out of the deep emotional system and the body brain. So much of the newer trauma research is saying that the subcortical brain, it's not really what you think in language, it's what you're feeling emotionally, and you kind of have to turn the ego off to do that. And there's no way to turn that into a number. And it's taken, you can say, well, this drug shrinks cancer better, or this virus is best treated with this drug, this germ is best treated with this drug. Psychology doesn't work that way because it's people and we're not numbers. And I think that so much damage has been done to my profession in the 80s when corporations take over healthcare and insurance companies and use them as, the profit motive is what we use to guide all of that. And then what you get is, well, CBT is the gold standard for everything. And it's not, and it really does so much damage that we're just now starting to undo. But that critique doesn't make any crazy thing that I want to sell you right either, right? Like somebody who has that critique and understands that doesn't mean that some wild out there thing is the only way you can get better. I like brain spotting a lot. It was really effective for me. I feel like it's very easy to replicate. Most people who say like, well, I don't really believe in this, and I'm like, yeah, just try it. Look right here. And it's like, it's such a profound and immediate effect that people are really shocked. And some therapies that work, you can still talk your way out of, but I think that stuff works. But anybody who tells you that only one of these is the only way to get better is hustling you and is wrong.
Yeah. I think you're very correct that psychology is like kind of notoriously difficult to pin down, and the measures, even if you are quantifying feelings on the day of, like, what makes you feel better today might not be the right long-term, uh, you know, trait that you want them expressing, right?
Well, especially with
Yeah,
trauma treatment, you are going to get worse before you get better most of the time because you're opening
yeah,
something up that you're avoiding. And so when you're confronting
right.
it, it's harder. You know, it's
Yeah,
like
you
trying to
walk out of
gain
that
weight
session.
without lifting, trying to like put on muscle mass without lifting weights. You got to lift the weights and you're going to feel worse and you're going to feel sore. And that's part of the process.
Absolutely
Um,
right. Yeah.
so the thing
And
that
yeah,
makes you feel better is not always making you be better.
yeah, and I think too, like just sort of the structure of a therapeutic environment is in and of itself really important and good. You know, you know, so much different than a clinical setting. You know, like I sought out therapy at one point, going through like a low point in my life, and just to be able to sit with somebody that I knew was there to listen to me and that I trusted to you know, give me advice, you know, divorce from the rest of my life, you know, just to have that isolated place where I could go and feel heard and safe, you know, like just that environment probably meant so much more to me than any specific thing that my therapist said or did for me. You know, so
Hmm.
it's I really think this is a place where um, therapists shine, and the doctors based on the more hard sciences fail. You know, like I read
Hmm.
somewhere that the most sure indicator of how often a doctor will be sued is how much time they spend with them on their first session.
Hmm. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
If it's a 10-minute in and out, the patient walks out feeling hostile and you know is then looking for that reason to sue. And you know, a doctor is not going to embrace you in a big warm fuzzy hug, you know, literally or figuratively, but they can find a happy medium. And I think
Yeah.
this is where a therapist is really really good at um, filling a role that's maybe not defined so much by science but by society. And as our social constructs seem to be breaking down a little bit, um, that's creating a hole that I
And the
think
social contract. I mean, it's like
yeah,
people don't like people anymore. I mean, there used to be, even if there were two sides or something, you know, there were some kind of group where you agreed and had community, and that is essentially going away in all spheres.
yeah, yeah. And so now you know we can pay a few bucks and get that from our therapist.
Well, yeah. Well, and I want to be respectful of your
I
time.
don't mean to like be reductive of what you do. Like I'm saying that's
No,
one
yeah.
upside. Yeah, yeah.
No, I
Oh,
mean,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I'm a pretty big advocate, which makes a lot of my peers mad for that. We say mental health, mental health, mental health awareness, but we don't really ever dig into how you actually get better other than, you know, making people aware that it exists. And I mean, I get flack for this, but I really believe that bad therapy is worse than no therapy. So yeah, therapy is important and you should get it, but you should be very careful of the kind that you get. And if something doesn't feel right, you should leave.
What do you recommend is kind of like the criteria to choose somebody? You know, when you're
Um,
seeking.
Psychology Today has a really good sorter where you can kind of look at what somebody is accepting of. I mean, one of the reasons, other than I think the technique works really well for brain spotting, one of the other reasons I like it is that it's very open ended and kind of intuitive, and so you get providers that have a little bit. I mean, I'm big on like that the opposite of truth is not lies; it's certainty. And when you think that you have all the answers, those are the people that are going to hurt somebody. That kind of think it gives them an excuse to be better than the law or better than the rules or whatever. And so, I mean, for me, like the people who say, well, I got a CBT degree or a DBT degree, and my professor said that that worked for everything in 1982, and I've done every single continuing education credit in that forever. That's, I don't want to, you know, some of the people who say that they do this one kind of therapy, they've actually learned some other things. So not everybody who just has done that is that kind of provider. But there's the thing where if this works for everybody and it's not working for you, then I start to think that you're doing it wrong. And even if I'm not saying that or I'm trying to control it, the
Mm,
patient feels this kind of resentment. Whereas with me, I want to have a big bag of tools for you. So I want to get trained and not just get the kind of therapy, the training, actually be in that as a patient. You don't just need the you need the aha of seeing how this stuff works.
Yeah.
And when you do that, you're going to say, okay, this isn't working for you. Let's put it down and try something else. And you're so
Yeah.
much less likely to damage somebody. You've got a clinician who's more curious, which is the thing you cannot teach. You know, when I interview, I'm like, what is the last thing that you read or saw in a magazine or saw anywhere podcast that you applied for your job? If you're talking about college 15 years ago, I'm not going to hire you. Okay. And you can't fake that question. Somebody who is a
Yeah.
sorry candidate can't sit there and go, oh yeah, I worked so hard to do this. You know, you can't come up with that if you have not learned anything in 10 years. You can't lie about that. And so I think the curiosity and the need to help people and get more tools and to kind of wonder that really that's what you want in a therapist, I think.
Yeah. And another way to think about that is like, you have to be sort of like, you have to be able to speak the language of the patient.
Mm,
Some patients are going to be receptive to certain treatments, and maybe they've got a predisposition against other forms of treatment, and so maybe one feels good in a certain cultural
mhm,
setting, and another one doesn't. And so
mhm.
when you have a bunch of tools in your toolkit, that allows you to speak more languages.
Well, and that's what's funny too is Irvin Yalom, the existential therapy guy from the 80s. He was always really critical of CBT, and he would be like, "Why do all these CBT therapists come to see me? Like, if it works so good, why don't you go see one of y'all's?" You know, he was just kind of real candid. But that is one of the things he points out is that he did a study himself, just a subjective one, where he had patients write. He wrote down what he did in each session and what worked and what was so brilliant, and then he had patients write down what happened in each session. And then a year after therapy, he'd go back and read it and what he thought was the profound helpful thing was never what the patient was thinking was profound and helpful. And he also has another thing, you know, where he says that I'm losing my train of thought now. Shoot. Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, Yalom was somebody who was kind of saying that there's something that's numinous. There's something about the relationship. It's two people that are kind of. He would never use the word spiritual because he's an existential therapist, but two people coming together to kind of wonder and love and be present. Something about that heals in a way that you cannot turn into a number. But then there also are techniques that are important. You know, a lot of bringing the body into healthcare and things. It's just very hard to heal trauma without having some kind of somatic component because we're just so much more than what we think. And so much of therapy wants to just be analytical and thinking about all this stuff, and you have to feel it. You got to go through it.
It sounds like it served you very well over a wide variety of situations. So that's really good for the work that you do.
Well, when you talked a lot in some of the things you written in media appearances about the kind of political problems that contribute to the healthcare that you're looking at. One thing I'd be interested to see what you think about is like drug. We talked a little bit about drug development, but like the free market doesn't incentivize us to make drugs that we need. Like what we really need right now is more antipsychotics and more antidepressants, or not antidepressants.
Mm,
We need some more, but more antipsychotics and more antibiotics. But those are a huge
mm,
risk because I gotta spend $1 million in a lab and maybe I don't come up with one. Where what's very easy to patent is statins, because every old white guy that's watching the Fox News and is overweight is going to be on one, and so you can
yeah,
kind of play with the research and say, well, this one is actually a little tiny bit better for your liver than that one, and then you find out that statistical variance is not real, right after it's in the common domain, and now it's not patentable anymore. So, um, but you're playing with a little sugar molecule, and it's very easy to invent a new statin because you just kind of mess with it until it's a tiny bit different enough to patent. And
yes,
then so we've got like 20 million of them. They're all the same. We don't need more statins, but we have super germs that are killing people in hospitals, and we have all of these treatment resistant forms of psychosis that really
yeah,
need drugs with better side effects. But they're not doing that because there's no money in it. I mean, do you encounter anything like that? Sometimes countries that socialize better research like Germany and Switzerland, you will get the antipsychotics coming out of there, but the majority of what's patented is just delivery mechanisms. It's like, okay, we're going to put the pill in a shot so it lasts for 30 days or something. And it's like, that's helpful, but you just did that because you could charge for it.
yeah. I mean, again, it just comes back to the market has too much control over. Yeah, that's a great example. Another great example is people who suffer from rare diseases, right?
Hmm.
If something's only afflicting, you know, 10,000 people a year in the United States, then I'm not going to develop a drug to help those 10,000 people when I could come up with something that I can advertise nationally and sell as a weight loss treatment to 150 million people.
Mm-hmm.
That would be irresponsible to my shareholders if I'm the pharmaceutical guy, right? And so
Yeah, even if the person is a good person, if they act on that morality, then the system gets rid of them. So they're either a bad person or they're a good person that's not allowed to do a good thing. I mean, this is the nature of the system.
Yeah. Have you ever heard of a B Corp?
Mm-mm.
It's basically a corporate structure. Right now, most like the problem that you just talked about with like you have to run a company a certain way for profit. The B Corp is a different corporate structure. It's a corporation. It's all the other things, but it also mandates that you put like public good and the good of your workers, like they're written into the DNA at the beginning. So it's basically like
Mm-hmm.
a corporation that's designed to make profit, but not solely to make profit. To also build in some social goods into that. And so, one potential solution would be to somehow increase the number of B Corps in these
Yeah.
industries that are so
You could
important.
incentivize them by taxing them different, and then people would behave differently,
Yeah. The cart is just driving the horse. The free market is allowing corporations to drive what they're going to sell to us. And instead,
Mm-hmm.
we need a strong hand in government that can dictate more or influence what we need, and then allow the companies to play to that. And it's problematic because pharmaceutical companies are, we all know, spending a lot of money to influence the political process. And so, you have to get money out of government, including pharmaceutical money out of government.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you need, like you need some sort of way to assess what the public need is, and
Mm-hmm.
then build a market around that. And still let these companies make their millions of dollars. But the problem is just that there's no upper limit to what they want to make, right?
Yeah.
And they've got enough power to keep making more.
Yeah.
So if there's a way to squeeze anything, any extra dollar out of a product, they're going to do it.
Mm-hmm.
My
Yeah.
screen just went blank.
I can still see it, so I don't know. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine. Yeah.
Well, I hope that people buy the book. It definitely is an important conversation. Do you have like another animal picked out for your next book? You got bear, duck. What's the?
I mean, the second book, I was initially thinking that I might just do it all based on leeches. But that just wound up being one of several storylines in the book.
Well, it does work for certain things. That's what's so wild is like they do still leech because they thin the blood in a way very localized that we don't have a drug that can do it that well.
Yeah, and we don't have a machine that can do it as delicately as a leech can. Just attaching all those little suckers. So that was a really interesting fact that came out of it. History of leeches in medicine is just fascinating. Next I am looking at the world of paranormal enthusiasts.
Oh wow.
So I've been talking to folks who are into like ghost hunting or mediums and spiritualists, or Bigfoot enthusiasts, Bigfoot hunters, ghost hunters, alien abductees, and seeing how they play into the kind of broader society, because their influence is growing and their numbers are growing, because belief in institutions is breaking down, and trust in institutions is breaking down.
Yeah.
So people who still want to answer those big questions, like what happens after I die, instead of going to a church, maybe now they're going to a medium, and
because
understanding
spirituality
the
doesn't
universe
go
in that way.
away. The unconscious doesn't go away. You
Exactly
can get
right.
rid of the Catholic Church or you can get rid of this belief and whatever, but we still have a part of us that is longing kind of for this transcendental, thing. And somebody like
Yeah.
Werner Herzog is clinging to logic, but then you look at what's unconscious and where he is putting the subject of his life and whatever, so it's like that's going to become hyperactive, as we become more kind of logical and numbers based, then the spirituality becomes more unconscious.
That's exactly right. As you say, like trust, or faith isn't going away. It's just being transferred from a top-down institution like the church to a grassroots, bottoms-up setting like a medium. And so that's a pretty big change. And so, what does that mean for all of us as a whole when millions of people are switching their methods of exploring spirituality?
Well, and I think that's where people get interested in the hero myth and depth psychology and the unconscious, is when public institutions are failing. Because like you see that when people feel like the government is an extension of me and it's doing my will, then I identify with that and I'm fine. When I feel like I don't have any say in this and it's going against my wishes, then I have to have some kind of personal power, and so that belief gets more esoteric and spiritual. So
Yeah.
and like that's a constant through history. Like you've got the Roman Empire, and everyone's like, oh yeah, they're parading these Gauls through the streets and these elephants. Like, my empire's going and doing all this cool stuff. Like, yeah, okay, great, I like it. You get the empire breaking down, and then you have Mithraic cults and all these things. And so it's like, I mean, that's one of the risks to me, in that people don't feel represented by their government, because I would argue it isn't representing their interests. And the risk
Yeah.
of that is, like, when people look at government and they're like, oh, I don't have any say in this, then an inevitable result is that 60% of your population will just believe in magic. And that is a pretty constant
Yeah.
throughout history.
Yeah. It's like this maddening dynamic where, like, okay, we've got a government that it's not transparent enough. It doesn't do well enough for us. So my solution is I'm going to chuck it and get another system with no accountability to the public and with no transparency whatsoever. Right? Like that doesn't track. And so, yeah, like clearly there are a lot of issues that need reform in order for people to feel represented by their government. But yeah, I don't think, building a new government from scratch is going to make anybody very happy.
Yeah, and you see, like, in the 70s, there's kind of economic malaise and people feel like stuff's not working, and you get Star Wars and all of this kind of depth
Oh
psychology
yeah.
stuff. And I mean, I think that's happening again. It's one of the reasons our practice kind of has the vibe it does. It's not the boomer, Zen rock stacked up, gentle time, come to therapy. It's like therapy is slaps. It's a part of life and art and growth, and we do state-of-the-art trauma treatment, but it's also cool, and our t-shirts are punk rock. Come on.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I mean, do you see that? Do you see that correlation, like in just culture, while you're looking at the topics you look at, or I don't know. You know more about it than me,
The
probably.
correlation between
People feeling like they're not able to have personal power through the government, and then looking for personal power through more kind of esoteric or personal means.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean that's kind of like a common thread, is that I'm looking for colorful and interesting stories, and people who are doing colorful and interesting things are people who are living outside of the norm, and living outside of the norm, means pursuing something that's a little different, right?
Yeah.
And doing, living those more esoteric lives. And yeah, so that's been really, really interesting to me. And I hope my books get across that, like, you know nobody's 100% bad, nobody's 100% good. I really try. Some people who read my books walk away saying, like, man, he was so mean to those people, he treats them like trash, he's got nothing but contempt. And other people read them and say, like, he was too nice to those people. These people, they killed their daughter. Why is he telling their love story, like that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I think, like, my approach is to be critical and biting and
And funny.
mean,
I mean, they're witty
and
books.
and funny, for some, for when they deserve it, but to also celebrate the good in each of them, and to kind of like paint that more subtle picture, or a more complex picture, I should say. And so I think that's serving me well. I feel like when I get criticism from both sides, I know I'm doing a good job.
Well, and I think that probably is informed more by people's relationship to their own shadow. If I'm really afraid of being called out on what I'm doing, that I'm going to have a different reaction to your book than if I feel like, oh, I don't want to be mean and I don't want to, accuse anybody. And I did something bad a long time ago that I don't think I can be forgiven for. So please don't point out that other people do bad things. You get more of that reaction.
Yeah. Start to get a little nervous, start to pull back a little bit.
Well, they're really great books, and anything that you feel like you'd like to kind of pitch or talk about that you don't have room to say, I don't want to keep you longer. I don't want to make you commit to a lot of time, but also it's fascinating talking to you, so we really appreciate it. And anything we don't get to or that you think is relevant or other projects you want to pitch?
Oh, I really appreciate you saying that, Joel. And yeah, no, I will just ask people to give my book a look. Of course, I'm delighted when someone buys it, but I'm also delighted when somebody goes and picks it up from the library or borrows it from a friend. I respond to emails from folks. If anyone has a thought that they want to share with me, my email address is on my website at Hongltz-Hetling.com. I really value the engagement from my readers, and I hope that people understand that the books are not just about serious topics, but as you said, they're fun, they're funny. My number one priority is to build narratives that are interesting and kind of read as something that will be entertaining. And then the weightier more thoughtful topics are the vegetables that come with the steak and potatoes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me on and let me plug my books. I knew from your emails that it was going to be a really interesting, thoughtful discussion, and I was not at all disappointed. This has been really, really great, and I hope we have a chance to do it again sometime soon.
Yeah, if you're writing a book about paranormal or you want to come in and talk about another topic, I mean, it's a huge area, so I'd be happy to have you again. I got a really big kick out of Matt's email back to me because our, clinic is we try and be on the cutting edge of something, but nothing's evidence-based until it is. And, I've been in 15 models of therapy. I've been trained in more than that, and I don't do all the ones I'm trained in because I don't think they all work. But brain spotting and a lot of things for very treatment-resistant things I like, but I totally did not believe in them until I sent them to a patient and had, a profound effect. And so when I was saying, hey, we do these therapies and will you come on our podcast? You were like, I want to make sure that you know that the book is a critique of Quack and not an endorsement. Which is, I got a huge kick out of that. Because the book is in our waiting room. And so like, when people come in, there's like, it says, the Quack, whatever. And I want to print out some pages, because you see people reading it when I'm like, come on back. And they're kind of, taking a picture of it so they can buy it later or whatever. And I want to just kind of print out some pages and paste them in there. So the first chapter is like, well, I went to Alabama and met Joel Blackstock, a social worker who's doing some, to the person. Oh yeah, come on in.
That would be pretty choice. You should do that.
Well, people like your books. We have a link to buy that in the episode description, and excited to see where your career takes you with the next one. I know a lot of ink has been spilled about the Monroe Institute and things, but have you ever heard of what's his name, John C. Lilly, the 70s CIA guy? That would be a fun one to look into. Someone needs to write that book. I don't think anyone has. He was this guy who was like a psychonaut. He got caught up in that whole thing where the CIA was like, we don't really know how any of psychology works. Maybe people can talk to their identical twin to share a message from Russia. Let's just do some experiments and see how much of the stuff. Maybe Ellis. Yeah. So he basically, is funded by NASA and everything. And he's like, okay, so the only reason that dolphins haven't learned to talk is that no one gave them LSD and tried to teach them. And the CIA is like, well, I mean, this hasn't been disproven yet. So they build him like a whole compound on this island that has waist deep water, and a lady lives in the compound with the dolphins. And they give the dolphins LSD. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah.
Carry on. Go on.
Yeah. Well, so the dolphins are male, and they just continue to try and mate with the lady, and they won't do it. So he's like, well, just go ahead and let them relieve themselves, and then try and teach them English. So the dolphins don't learn English. Spoiler alert. And
Like,
slowly,
you can't believe.
well, it was Hustler magazine, like, found out what they were doing and wrote like an erotic tale about it. And then so someone at NASA was reading Hustler. I don't know if they owned up to that and was like, "What the hell are we paying?" And then realized what this guy was doing in the island and canceled all the research. And by then he was on to some new thing. One of the things that's great about John C. Lilly is he lived long enough to have discovered YouTube, like in the YouTube version 1.
Oh,
So some of the
okay.
last things that he did are these like clips of him in, like, the MS Paint of video editing, with spaceships and things edited behind him, talking about how you can use crystals to talk to the soul of whales. And then if we're going to combat climate change, this is a technique we all need to learn. So yeah, the last time I checked, those were still up on his YouTube channel of the late John C. Lilly. But yeah.
Wow.
And then it inspires a bunch of stuff like that. What is it? His like Altered State, that John Hurt movie, the first movie he was in, is based on Lilly. And then Day of the Dolphin is like this Mike Nichols project that is really, really bad, about talking dolphins. But yeah, he has a lot of cultural resonance, but people don't always know where it came from.
I think there was a Saturday Night Live skit about that dolphin research situation.
Oh, really?
I think so. Yeah, like, yeah, they don't name it or anything, but it's like dolphins, waist deep water, sexual tension.
Yeah, luckily the people who do our community brain
Laboratory.
mapping have a pretty good sense of humor, but it's like, okay, we now have a brain scanning machine in our basement. Are we going to be feeling what's coming up in 2 years? Are we going to be feeding LSD to dolphins? Like, where will tower therapy go? We won't, but it is funny.
Yeah, jeez.
Well, thanks so much. I'll go ahead and sign off right now. Let's see. So I'm gonna end the recording.